Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Very good to see people joining. We'll just give it a few minutes. It's very good to see you, Janice. Good to see you, Dr. Munyao, Dr. Gazy, Nancy. Very good to have you with us. Amos, it's always good to have you with us. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. We'll be doing a couple of things. We have a welcome, and we're going to have a word from the project that is hosting us, and then we'll dive right into it. I'll just give it a couple of minutes as people join in. Let's see who else has joined us now. Irina, George Dirango, Benedict. Very good to see you. Abel Simiu, as always. Nice to have you with us. Thank you, Anne. Thank you for joining us. Good. I think we can go ahead, and the others will join us as we go along. So welcome to today's panel discussion on the whole idea of building scenarios for the future. We're going to have a few rules right now. You're going to be seeing the panelists, and you're going to be seeing the presentation that is going to happen. But I'm going to invite you to engage with us on the question and answer right on the portal, on the Zoom portal. And we're going to have a lead panelist. She's going to share her presentation, and then we'll have some responses, and then we're going to get into the discussion. My name is Kiama Mugambi, and I'm excited to be able to host this for us. We are hosted by the Project on Religious Freedom and Society in Africa, based at the Yale Macmillan Center. And so, without further ado, I'm going to invite Dr. Mike Blair up to give us a word from our host, the Project on Religious Freedom and Society in Africa. And then after that, I will introduce our panelist for the day. Welcome.
Thank you, Kiama, for the introduction. So yes, my name is Michael Blair, and I'm the Executive Director of the Project on Religious Freedom and Society in Africa. We've been at Yale for the last 6 years. We were founded by Maman Sani and myself, and we've done a number for even last 12 years. We've been doing conferences and workshops in Africa about religion and society. And so this is a kind of in fact, our last conference was held in Limuru. That was our last actual physical conference that we had, was in Limuru, talking about issues facing Kenya with church and academic leaders. So during this time of the pandemic, we've switched to more online. So we have a program with the Sani Institute out of Ghana, and so we have 12 lectures that you can see on their website, and then we also have this twice-a-year lecture series with our friends in Kenya, which Kiama is usually the person that helps find our speakers. So we have good representation in our program from Kenya, including Nora, which is our project administrator. So welcome. Looking forward to today. I'm glad that everyone could make it.
Thank you, and welcome again to everyone who is joining us, Agatha, and others who are continuing to join us. Thank you so much for being a part of this. We're going to, in just a short while, listen to the presentation for the day, which is going to come from Dr. Katindi Sivi. She's one of our top female futurists on the continent, and is the founder of Longview Consult and Longview Futures. Foundation. These are organizations that facilitate futures research, policy analysis, foresight strategies, and they do training. She has published books, book chapters, articles on a whole range of topics: youth demographics, youth employment, socioeconomic and gender inequalities, governance, elections, civic engagement, women futures, gender inclusion, among other subjects. She has worked with the government of Kenya's Vision 2030, and also worked with the Executive Office of the President on the Global Youth Unemployment Initiative. Her CV is from Regent University, and it is on strategic foresight. She has also received training from on scenario building from the Said Business School at Oxford University. And she's also a member of several professional bodies, Association of Professional Futurists, Collaborative Futures, and as the Millennium Project. She strongly believes that teaching Africa's population to be future-oriented is going to empower us to shape our spheres of influence. So for me, it's a real privilege to have known her for a number of years and to have learned from the work that she has been doing, and to have her speak to a whole range of groups of people that I have worked with. And so it's my distinct privilege to welcome our very distinguished lead panelist, who's going to share from a pre-recorded presentation, and then thereafter we're going to interact, have some responses, and then interact. So welcome, Dr. Sibi.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Dr. Katindi, as you have been told, and I will be making a presentation on post-election Kenya 2025, a scenarios project we did last year. And we want to present this to you as a way of thinking about politics and public life in Africa. So in my presentation, I'm going to introduce strategic foresight and some data, as well as the scenarios outcome that came from the project that I mentioned. So strategic foresight is really about looking at the future and looking at possible outcomes that we could face, whether we like it or not. So as opposed to history, it is a forstory. And we probably look at different futures, like different possibilities that could occur, plausible futures, projected futures, preferable futures, depending on what the outcome will bring. The difference between foresight and, prediction is the fact that prediction has one official future. And so we perhaps use forecasting data to look at what the patterns will present to us. Foresight, on the other hand, is acknowledging that the future is unknown and there are many factors that are going to be at play. Some of them are with us and some of them are surprises in the future that haven't yet happened. So we want to take into account all those factors and then begin to ask, depending on whoever is making decisions and the systems that are at work, what are the things that we might begin to see, whether we like it or not. And so we have different stories about the future, and we use that then to do strategy. Foresight then becomes a much more wider exercise where we combine evidence, expertise from different professions, interactions of people who wouldn't ordinarily be in the same room, as well as creativity for us to be able to get those stories. We then use futures thinking as a way of consciously monitoring the external environment consistently to be able to surface some of these issues that could occur. And so in a sense, you're scanning the environment, scanning the horizon to be able to have collective intelligence about what are these things that we need to pay attention to. And then we want to understand possible occurrences in the system so that we know what the future might look like. The idea, though, is not just to have that information, but to come back and act before rather than after the fact. We are doing this because traditional strategy planning is not very helpful. What is happening is that the world is becoming more volatile, more uncertain, more complex, constantly changing and ambiguous. And so because of that, we are finding ourselves really dealing with a lot of disruptions. And these are really making our plans obsolete even before we plan, or we start planning, or we even finish, executing the plans. And so we feel like for strategic foresight is a much better way of fortifying what the future might look like and helping us to be a bit more ready. Now, the process is less linear than traditional strategic planning processes. And you start by understanding the central point or the central question that you want to deal with. So you have a purpose for why you're doing a scenarios exercise. And then you carry out very robust research around those issues, and not just the main issue, but the related issues as well. And then using that information, one is able to build different or multiple futures that might occur. And based on that information, then one is able to decide what they would like to see and work towards that future, but at the same time, design or deduce what they might have to face, whether they like it or not, and find strategies to avert what they do not want to see. So the plan is much more fortified in the sense that you're putting in place plans to be able to be ready in case of any disruptions, but at the same time, you're working towards the goal that you intend to do. So just to mention that scenarios planning as well, or futures thinking and foresight thinking, it takes into account, how the system works, so that you're also factoring in things that you're not in control over as well. And that's what makes it much more strategic than traditional planning processes. Now, because our quest was to look at using foresight in light of the 2022 elections, we started by asking ourselves what the data looks like. And we started by the obvious, which is the numbers. And we are saying that what is unique about 2022 elections is two things. Number one, it is a transition election since the 2010 constitution came into place. What that means is that constitutionally, people who have held, 10 years in office are doing their last term. And so it's time to exit and to have new people. And traditionally, transitional elections in Kenya have been the bloodiest. So that's something to take into account. I think number two is the youth demographics that are in this year's elections. And if you look at the census, the 2019 census, you find that the number of new voters will be 3.5 million. Now, that is if they all register. But cumulatively, all young people, and by this I mean those who are 18 to 35 and are eligible to vote in accordance to the Kenyan Constitution, will form 56% of all the voters. And then, of course, those who are above 35 will form 12 million people. What we are saying is that young people in Kenya have the possibility of determining how these elections will pan out. But will that be the case? Okay. So number one, what we are also seeing in relation to those two factors is that there are many young people who are unemployed. And so youth unemployment in Kenya is at 40%. Usually, when that happens, we see that then there are a lot of young people who are easy to mobilize and can be, easily taken as foot soldiers to cause mayhem. Okombo and Sana in 2010 did an interesting study to find out what it takes to have young people to do, to be involved in issues that would cause violence and chaos during elections. And they did find out that they only need to be paid between $2 and $6 for them to cause any disruptions, but only about $10 to be able to do the more atrocious things. Now, they also benefit. Sometimes they don't even have to be paid with a monetary value. So they benefit from food or alcohol or drugs and a semblance of power in the fact that they are going to be used to, create chaos. And so what we are saying is that Kenya right now has a big number of young people that can be mobilized for political violence. And that's something to think about. Demographers do say that 80% of civil conflicts occur in countries where 60% of the population or more were under the age of 30. In Africa and in Kenya, 68% of the population was under the age of 30. What we are saying is that by the virtue of our numbers, we are very big candidates for political violence. When we did ask young people this year, what are their greatest fears about 2022 elections, 63% did say that they're afraid of disruptions and violence. 44% and 38% did say that they are worried about political malpractice, that is rigging and voter bribery. And, about 37% did say that they see a lower voter turnout. The other interesting thing about young people is that, and one of the ones that we are noticing is, as much as they are able to be mobilized for political violence, we also see that they are very reluctant to, participate in these elections. A lot of them have expressed their disillusionment and their disengagement, partly because they feel like their vote won't make a difference. And when we sought to find out how would they prefer to participate, a lot of them talked about through social media. And as you can see, few of them want to really formally engage in the formal processes that constitutes political participation. We did ask this question in a different way and asked, how did you, have you voted before? As you can see, 66% has voted before, but out of those, they say that only 61% will want to vote this year. Then another thing that we noticed in this data is that a lot of them increasingly want to participate in processes that have formal payment. So, for example, participating in civic education and in, the actual, under official capacity during the elections, like voting or being a returning officer, as opposed to actively campaigning for a candidate or attending political rallies. Now, a lot of them, when we did ask for them to explain, they said, unless they are guaranteed of some monetary value or some gift, meaningful gift like a hat or a t-shirt, they will not attend rallies or campaign for the candidate. Again, this is beginning to show us that, yes, young people are also becoming more disillusioned and less engaged. One interesting contradiction we did see is that a lot of young people are saying they are concerned about corruption. If we ask directly, will you take a bribe from a politician in order to elect them, they say no. But when you ask them, will you accept any incentives from a politician to be able to vote for them, they say they will. And they don't define that as corruption, they define that as incentive. And so we begin to see the change of language and the sanitization of corruption in that regard. Interestingly, also, when we did ask this question in a different way, but sought to ask what kind of leader do you want to, what kind of political leader do you want to elect? Most of them talked about a visionary leader, and very few, not very few, but less than 50%, which is 44%, did talk about ethical leadership. And yet they are all concerned, or most of them are concerned about corruption. So we thought that was an interesting contradiction, and it does, of course, have implication on how the next 5 years will pan out. And so in an exercise that was given to us as a consultancy by this organization funded by USAID and FHI, we sought to ask ourselves, what might Kenya look like in 2025? Now, at the time we were doing this work, we were looking at the question of the Building Bridges Initiative, which was a drive to, or a proposal to amend the Constitution and to look at the implications of that, as well as the 2022 elections on Kenya in 2025. Now, I did mention that the process is elaborate. We wanted to understand the trends from data. We also did do about quite a number of focus group discussions. And for this, we wanted to see what are people's mental models, what are people's, beliefs, and, the prejudices that are surrounding these issues. And we wanted to surface assumptions that people are making on this issue about elections and at the time BBI as well. So in total, we talked about 200 people countrywide, and we held this 7 meetings. From the discussions that we had, several things were said to be the ones that are going to, be key drivers of the future, or key drivers in the next maybe 3 years. The first one is the campaign period, which includes the level of elite control and ethnic-based organizing. And they felt that this campaign period, and depending on what the politicians do, the tone of their campaigning, it could determine whether we go into a conflict, a full-blown conflict or not. The second one was, of course, this whole question about political patronage and clientelism. And obviously, to what allegiance will key players have, and depending on the side, the political side or the political divide. Then obviously, how will people mobilize? So the ethnic camps and how they pan out will be an interesting one. The other one, of course, will be the management and outcome of the 2022 elections by the official bodies like the IEBC. Then the voting patterns that are influenced whether by culture, mythology, and symbolisms. And this was an interesting one because it begins to talk about, to what extent do these myths or cultures begin to play a part in determining how people vote. So if an oak tree, falls, does that mean it's the end of an era, for example? A big number of youth voters oblivious of the democratic history of Kenya, like I did say earlier, and the election outcomes, to the extent that it bridges the trust deficit. And by this, we mean that, if people feel that the election results do not fairly reflect their voting pattern, then there will be a problem. Then responses of citizens, political elite, and security agencies after the elections and the election outcome. Then the action and decisions of critical institutions, especially the judiciary. And in this case, we are talking about the judiciary becoming a key arbiter in the contestation of political results, but also the politicization of the judiciary will be a key issue. Then the role of political parties and their behavior, their binaries and so forth, the new alliances that will be forming, the state of the economy and who controls it. And people felt that at this point in time when we're doing this work, the issue of COVID, the issue of high cost of living was going to be a big determinant in deciding who the leadership will be. And then technology, in as far as it is deployed during elections, either to control or to securitize as well as to influence, the outcomes. And obviously that goes hand in hand with the role of big data. So those are the things that people thought we should factor in. Now, we came up based on that work with 3 possible scenarios of what Kenya could look like in 2025. And the first one was really an outcome that looks at the dynasties or the political elite taking over. And in this scenario, it was seen as a coronation of a monarchy or a conferring of the power of, a selected leader, all right? So that there's an elite pact to sustain that hegemony. So that's the narrative there. And we were saying that a lot of these people who are the political elite are also the owners of the economy. And so they consolidate that power to continue profiting from, whether it's COVID merchandise and any other things, state corporations and things like that, to continue profiting from that. And then obviously, then the citizens are pacified by, this issue around the political elite consolidating power so that where there was a divide during elections, there's now a handshake and a government of national unity so that there isn't that divide anymore. And so they are pacified by that because the political divide is what brought them to be divided in the first place. And so what happens is that for the political elite continue their rulership, but they also try and, use this efficiency and effectiveness language to be able to consolidate power, continue their, economic quote unquote swindling. And, people feel like there's some, progress in the country because life is not as hard as it could be because the economy is doing well. So there's goodwill, there's rising investor confidence, after the elections because, the country is stabilized. There's a renegotiation of debt, for example, and, the economy begins to do relatively well, as it always does after the elections. And then technology is obviously cleverly deployed to make sure that the private interests are taken care of and that indeed the coronation does happen. And this is just a picture that was sent out by Kenyans on Twitter to say or to mention that the children of the founding quote unquote fathers of this country are the ones that are contesting for that political space, and they represent this scenario. Now, the second scenario is a scenario that is asking, what can you possibly do? And in this scenario, it is one where a leader, yes, there is an election, but it's an arrangement that then is classic to the Putin-Medvedev democracy. And so what this scenario was trying to say is that the current leadership doesn't go anywhere and that it remains in power and uses the people in power as proxies. So, and it is done whether it's through coercion and through state resourcing to make sure that that happens. Now, there's high militarization of COVID and other disasters to enforce, whether it's continued borrowing and to the installation of them being in power. And then citizens actively engage in this form of selection, so to speak, by resisting. Unlike in the first scenario where they comply and they just move on with their lives, these ones, they contest this outright authoritarianism out online. And life is very costly. The country is still very highly indebted. There are deep vulnerabilities, and technology is actively used by citizens to enhance their freedoms and to engage in public matters. So in this case, they don't just accept and move on, but they do speak about accountability issues online. In the last scenario, we talk about a change in political order. And this is much more of a hustler narrative where we are saying that, it is almost like a revolt by the people. And in this coalition or in this formation, the front runner is not an insider of the political elite. And so the what we call the deep state really tries to bar this person from vying. And they, in this case, one of the things that was coming out is that they unleashed Chapter 6, which is, of the Constitution, and they are barred from vying on corruption basis. And so people galvanize that issue is one that enables people to galvanize and to continue supporting this particular coalition. And then what happens is that we get a front runner who is not known to the people and who is not really your usual politician. And because of this accidental coalition, as they merge, but they win on the basis of, the revolt by the people. And because of that win, what tends to happen is that then there's disruption at different levels. So first of all, they inherit a very broke government, but also a government that is destabilized by other underhand factors. And so in order to survive, because things are so bad at that political level, they begin to abet the illegal goings on, including being bought to survive, and the economy pretty much collapses. Technology is deployed for surveillance and curtail freedoms, and we are trying to come back to the equilibrium because Kenya is actually on its way on a very slippery slope. So based on those, what we were saying is that we are not prescribing that this is what is going to happen. We are saying that as things stand, those are possibilities that could happen in the next 3 years. And we want to understand those different eventualities. They are not the only ones, but these are conversation starters, and we want to strategically prepare for change. We are saying that we are using this and hoping that people can use this as a basis for more scenarios work, but also to challenge various assumptions. One of the ones that is a big one is people underestimate this high cost of living as a big disruptor. They also underestimate this citizens, move on hustlers to be able to, that it's a passing cloud. And we want to provoke strategic thinking. We want to test preparedness. We also want to enable tactical responsiveness, particularly in the spaces around the official institutions that will have to manage the elections and would have to make key decisions on different outcomes. And so we are using this as ways to be able to try and foster those kinds of conversations. The point I think we are trying to make is that we need to decide as Kenyans what future we would like to see and what we don't want to see, and then begin to ask ourselves what are the creative solutions we can have and what priorities should we be thinking about. How do we, for example, stop violence? How do we, for example, get more young people to vote and vote wisely? How do we ensure that the IEBC is much more prepared, and so forth. So those are the scenarios, and we hope that they will be conversation starters for you as well to be able to, have food for thought and, to discuss this in your spaces. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate that very good presentation. We're going to have a quick summary. Thank you for those who have joined us as we have been listening to this. Carol, welcome. Jerusha, Josh Kikuvi, good to see you here. King Wakamenchu, Kellen, welcome. And Susan as well. Good to have all of you joining with us. So we're going to have a couple of quick responses. One of them is a summary from the perspective of a church leader. Reverend Goyo Dera will give his response basically in two parts: a summary of what he had in the way that he had it, and then some of what he feels are the implications of that. And then we'll have a quick short comments from one who has become a regular panelist with us, Darius Okola, and he can give his own take of it from his economics perspective. So let's have the Reverend Goyo Dera's summary and implications.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to give my reflections on the presentation by Katindi, Dr. Katindi, on the post-elections 2025 scenarios, a way of thinking about politics in public life in Africa. So my response, I've been requested to give a response as a church leader, and I'll go ahead with giving my observations first. My first observation is on strategic foresight and looking at the future. And I'm understood this as looking at the future and wrestling with the possible outcomes. Unlike history, scenarios is more a force story, looking ahead. Another observation I made about strategic foresight is different from predicting or prediction. Strategic foresight brings a different thing about looking into the future, whereas prediction has one possible outcome. My observation was that strategic foresight works with multiple scenarios whilst taking into account empirical evidence, expertise, qualitative interactions, and creativity to get outcomes. I've interacted with this strategic foresight and thinking at a previous session with Dr. Katindi, and it was really valuable experience for me, especially at the turn of the 2007-2008, when I first came in contact with this tool of understanding the future and preparing for it. I think strategic foresight also brings around the wrestling with the future outcomes. And when you wrestle with it, you come up with multiple outcomes, the possible, the plausible, the projected, the probable, and even the preposterous, teetering on hyperbole. And so you have to look through these things, and it gives us this. The presentation also gave some interesting analysis, and my observation here that exists a huge youth population that is unemployed and underemployed here in Kenya. Another observation from this presentation was about half of the young people who engage in public affairs do it on social media. I'm not sure if we fully understand or appreciate this, but this is an analysis that was brought about by this presentation. Now, this youth population was also asked if they shall vote in the coming elections. And I would like to say what I see is about 60% of this population indicated that they would vote. However, another observations on this is that political engagement for youth is predicated on them getting some pecuniary benefit. And that is why the more they engage is because they will get something in return, usually in pecuniary form. And this makes them prone to be used or manipulated. Another one of the things that I observed is that the contradiction that the research brought about this young population, whereas 88% are concerned with corruption. When they were asked, will you accept a bribe from a politician, they said no. This question asked differently, as I observed in this, will you accept an incentive from a politician to vote? They said yes, and that's the contradiction over here. And you'll hear some of my responses on my thoughts about this. I think the other surprising observation I made is that 44% of this same population said they would vote for an ethical leader. What happens to the other 66% rather, if they're presented with another kind of leader, especially if we go back to the place of pecuniary benefit? How much more will they be manipulated in that? And so the three scenarios that Dr. Katindi came up with were informed by a few observations for me: political patronage, management of the elections, voting patterns, election outcomes, the judiciary working as arbiter, state of the economy, technology and influence. And so it brings up three scenarios that she put up. One is system ya matapeli. I think here the big thing is about those who are elite having their crowning moment and having what they wanted. And the elite control the economy, a citizenry that is pacified because of the handshake, a government of national unity. There's a growing economy, the national debt is renegotiated, and the current debt that we have, there is relief from the debt repayment. That stress has been relieved. There'll still be high income inequality, but the general economy will increase and somehow trickle down to the rest of the public who begin to do well. Scenario number two was the Utadu scenario, where the example of Putin and Medvedev and what happened in the mid-2010s, where Putin had already served his second term and went to become a prime minister when Medvedev became the president in Russia. But we know who pulled the strings. So the elite, in this case, don't leave power, but rule by proxy. And through this, there's militarization of control for the public, possibly because of lack of legitimacy. The citizenry resist authoritarianism. Another thing is I observe from this is the high cost of living, and the country continues to be stressed by the debt. Life becomes very hard, where the things just become hard. And then citizens use technology to fight for their freedoms. Lastly is the third scenario, and this one is what I can also term as the hustler scenario, where there's a surprise winner from outside the system of the political elite. What we call, what this research, Dr. Katindi said, was an accidental coalition, will form the next government, but it's informed by a large disaffected voter base. The hustler narrative will have victory, and this is what will inform how we do politics, how we do and run government. It inherits an indebted economy. The deep state and the government bureaucracy begins to undermine those who are elected, and the nation continues to suffer under increasing debt and brings about a lasting economic collapse. So my thoughts here is, this is actually very good content for critical conversations on where we go after the elections. I concur with Dr. Katindi that we should not underestimate the effects that high youth unemployment and high cost of living could have on the elections and its outcomes. This hustler narrative, I want to suggest, as I look at it, is not a passing cloud. It is here to stay until successive governments can begin to work for the unemployed, and mainly for young people. Another thought that brings this presentation brings to me is that if we're not careful, this narrative can be weaponized and can work against the nation's dreams and aspirations. This hustler narrative. There's great need in teaching and engaging our rich history, especially our democratic history, and how we got to where we are today as Kenya. Our youth need to know this. I'm not sure they do appreciate this younger generation in this country. It appears that the youth may know the players, but do not know what happened, the implications, the good, the bad, even the ugly. I think there's a great need for the young people to appreciate how and why history played out the way it did, and how it affects us today. A big thing, this is not news, but I think it's very apparent here, that technology, its use, the use of digital platforms, social media, big data, are big game changers, and they appear in all scenarios. I'd like to suggest anyone in decision-making, whatever level, ignore this at your own peril. I'd like to also say, with this, consider creative ways to leverage technology. This is my thoughts. But back to the initial conversation, we need to do more and more strategic forecasting, mainstream this in our public affairs decisioning. Well, this is my response, and I hope it will continue to inform us in our future. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So good to have Reverend Gowi Odera make his comments. I think we're going to have one more brief comment. Nice to have you, Darius. If you'd just go ahead and make your own observations. And I'm going to invite those who are with us. If you could just put your questions on the Q&A tab. There's a Q&A tab at the bottom, to the bottom right, right at the bottom there, and you can ask your questions. I can already see there's a question there. and then we're going to address and have, Dr. Katindi and other panelists, engage with us. So Darius, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kiama. Thank you, Dr. Katindi, for that presentation. And thank you, Reverend Goi, for some of the critical issues you've raised. And I mean, I would like to address about maybe 6 of them, just in quick succession, in terms of just basically buttressing the issues that both of you have raised. And one of them is on the issue of the voting cluster, especially given the fact that the latest polling shows that about 30% of Kenyans still consider themselves undecided voters. We are about 140 days to the elections. And just for context, in 2007, 2013, and 2017, those figures were 8%, 5%, and 10% respectively. So to have it at 30% is quite a telling, in terms of how the voting cluster is trying to grapple with the current issues of the elections. And of course, there are many ways we can square that out, but having that kind of a number portends a very critical issues, and especially on the trust deficit that I think Dr. Katindi, you mentioned, in terms of just how the voting public is perceiving the options they feel they are stuck with, especially the key options they feel they are stuck with, and whether there's a possibility that any of these key options that they are stuck with, political options, can deliver a kind of a change, within the public space. So having a 30% undecided voters 140 days to the elections, when the numbers have always been below 10 years for over 20 years, actually, because even 2002, the number was far much lower than that. So basically, for the first time in over 2 decades, you have a third of the voters undecided, 140 plus days to the elections. There are many ways we can square that out, and it's a conversation worth revisiting. The second one, of course, is the hustler conversation, which you've raised, and I think Reverend Goi has touched on it. And the critical question there is the fact that there's nothing accidental or incidental about the hustler narrative. And the hustler narrative here is not the political dimension of it, which has been hijacked by one faction of the leading coalitions. Is the fact that I'll give a bit of a very brief context. The economy was increasing at an increasing rate between 1999 and 2007. From 2007, after the post-election violence and then the 2008 drought, the economy continued increasing, but at a decreasing rate. But one of the factors that was ignored within that time frame was the fact that inflation shot up very highly after 2007. But what's interesting is the class dimension of the inflation, which is the inflation went up about 40% for the middle and upper classes, but it went up 70% for the poor. What that does is that it essentially broke the ladder between the middle and upper classes and the lower classes in the country. So essentially, the economy was still growing, but for who? That's the question nobody asked in the second term of Kibaki's government. And then, so what we are seeing is the economy is still growing, but growing at increasing at a decreasing rate. And eventually by 2015, around February of 2015, for those of us in the economic space, the Kenyan economy stopped growing. And then it started, of course, we went into the debt and the cement addiction, building SGR and all these things. But what's more important about that conversation is the fact that from 2015, as much as we can look at the available reports, poverty started rising. And right now, the poverty has risen by about 20% under the current regime and stands at about 53% now. Now, that's very critical, given that this is the same government that has borrowed. They literally had a 1.9 trillion debt. They've brought it to about 9. It's going 10 trillion. So they borrowed more than anyone else did. But in the period that they were borrowing is also within the same period that essentially the poverty rates in the country were increasing. So the economic class question, the hustler versus dynasty question, there's a political overtones to it. but it was an inevitable part of how our political economy was structured. We made foundational and fundamental mistakes between 2007 and 2013 that essentially ensured a class war was going to be inevitable in how we had structured how we share resources in this country. And that, of course, it was hijacked. Of course, we have now a hustler versus dynasty narrative, and of course, it has all these political overtones, and it's sort of a fragile ground to walk around, to walk on. But the economic class war in this country was, whether we had Ruto take it up, or the other side of the government take it up, or Azimio, or whatever coalitions are there currently, the class basically conflict was inevitable post 2007, and none of the reforms that were needed to forestall that being forthcoming. So in a sense, as I think as Reverend Gowi you have mentioned, this is not about to end. Right now, we do not have any foundational policy interventions that can forestall the current, class conflict. And in a sense, it would be important to do something about it, but because it's been politicized, we're trying to find our ways around it, because politics tend to be a touchy conversation and a touchy issue in this country. But inevitably, we have to talk about how do we solve the class question, because the class question is not simply a political question. It is, how did we allow some of the structural inequalities, structural problems that came into the Kenyan economy in 2007 to fester for over 13 years later? What were some of our public policy interventions that were available that we did not take, that inevitably led us to where we are? So, that's an interesting conversation, and thank you, Gowi, for mentioning the fact that this will not end in August. As long as we do not question the foundational problems in how we distribute resources in this country and the resource structure in this country, the class question is going to worsen, and whether you have it at a political class level, dynasty level or not, the class tension is going to last for, my estimations, and I have a whole bunch of variables to look into. I don't think we can raise it within the time we have, but there are certain variables that still will feed it that need to be addressed. The third point, so the first point was on the undecided voters, the second one was on the class question. The third one is what we are staring at down the road is essentially, we are likely to deal with elite insecurity more than we are likely to deal with a voter insecurity. We are likely to see a bigger fallout within our elite, essentially, and we already have significant elements of that elite fallout, then we are likely to see it among the voters. And this is foundationally because, in a sense, the class question has already sort of created a significant wedge to how politics and political issues are foundationally organized in this country. So it is normative. It's coming into a space where we've always organized ethnically, at least. And now the class question is it's not new, but it's taking on a far much more significant dimension of our voter consciousness than it has at any period, at least in known history. And that, of course, means you have a lower likelihood of the kind of operational street level violence that we foundationally know associated with the elections, because the kind of people who feel or seem most aggrieved and are best able to articulate their grievances tend to be quite a well-educated but economically disadvantaged cluster, which is a bit different from the lowly educated and significantly disadvantaged cluster, which resides mostly in the informal settlements and are much easier to mobilize for operational violence, like in terms of the vigilantes and the militias. So what you're seeing in this country over the last maybe 10, 12 years is a significant population of well-educated, quite well-informed, fairly articulate cluster, but who also a fairly resentful subculture, who understand what they deserve, so to speak, but are not able to appropriate those resources within our political economy. And that essentially changes something in terms of the kind of risk that we face, especially on the security dynamics, because these are people who they're more likely to poison popular conversations online, and especially that brings in the dimension of technology, than they are to go to the streets and pick up a machete and chase people. So that is a very, very significant dynamic that comes into that space. Of course, there's the question of judiciary, which is in essence one of the last.
Darius,
I'm almost done.
Maybe you can go quickly, because I've just seen an interesting question that that interfaces into what you're doing. Just finish with the judiciary. I'd like to.
So the judiciary as the final cluster, the millennial question, which is the generational dynamics in the elections, and then the final one is the fact that whoever is coming in is inheriting a broke government, and essentially one of the key jobs, once they step into that office, they sort of the 100-day kind of a turnaround thing is to fix the political economy, because the most battered dynamic within our society right now has been the political economy in terms of the rule of law, the regulatory agencies, and so on and so forth. So that will be one of the foundational, challenges for whoever steps into that office between August and basically they have a very narrow window of a stressed out public that needs somebody to do at least 1, 2, 3 things very fast to assure them that there's a sense of competence in that space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darius. There's something that you mentioned over there that seems to point to 2 questions or 2 comments and / questions that have been raised that I think I would want to hear, especially Dr. Sivi's response on. And thank you for all those who have put your questions on the question and answer. So Nancy talks about that she noted that the scenarios are silent on the role of media, civil society, and the role of the youth. Is this deliberate? And then something else based on the scenarios. I haven't read the full question there, but there are a couple of comments. Nancy does say, however, that ask the question, what may surprise us about the future? What headlines did the participants come up with, assuming that there was engagement with media, civil society, and the youth? But then Anne, I think, is more directed. And I feel like that those 2 are related, and they are related to something that Darius had just said, which kind of stood out for me. The possibility of a 4th scenario. I suppose the possibility of more scenarios, maybe I should just say more scenarios, the possibility of more scenarios, occasioned, for example, by the absence of scenario 1, political dynasties, and the hustler. What kind of scenario would emerge if we didn't have those 2? Especially with the challenge of the youth bulge, and the heightened political tension. So all those factors held constant. If you removed political dynasties and hustler. And Nancy is asking, okay, so what if we factored in media, civil society, and so on? And I like those comments / questions, because they're doing exactly what the scenarios you said they're supposed to do, which is to kind of jog our minds. So go ahead. Yeah, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are around that.
So what I presented was a very summarized version, and I have a book that I will maybe pass on to you. Then anyone who registered can get the full book. And definitely the scenarios did factor in the central role of youth and media. In the first scenario, the youth and civil society and media are completely swallowed up by this narrative of effectiveness and efficiency. And it is the peacepreneur type of scenario where people just want to get done with elections because they are always so disruptive. They want to go back to business as usual. And because of that desperation and because of this concerted effort by the leaders to then obviously, keep it going for their own benefit, everyone is co-opted. And there's a very cleverly articulated narrative in that regard. In the second scenario, though, we said that young people, it's a bit of an autocratic scenario where the leadership is very high-handed. But what then the citizens do is to bypass media, because media is captive of by the central government, and they go to social media, and that's where they engage. And so there's a lot of very robust governance discussions, human rights discussions going on there, but social media, because that's where the power of, whether it's young people and other actors, especially civil society, because the central government doesn't give them that space. In the third scenario, young people are, first of all, it is a demonstration of people's power. And people's power, that last scenario is a vote against the dynasties. I must say that, by the way, these scenarios were done in 2020, and we sort of like finished them in 2021. So this language of dynasties and so on is an appropriation of language that was already there before. And I think that is critical, because when people look at them, will say, oh, but you're saying already what's happening. That was before, people coalesced and started using the language. And in this scenario, what we are saying is that people, whether it's rural areas or, all these young people out there in informal settlements, people, and even the middle class, they join forces to be able to vote against what we are calling the dynasties, because they feel that whether it's like the statistics that Okola gives about, more poverty, more inequality, more rising inflation, it is a vote against those things. And, the leader that comes rides on that wave of the vote against the dynasties to be able to get elected. Unfortunately, in this scenario, there are people who've been controlling government, they know the mechanics of government, and so they really sabotage that so that this government eventually becomes desperate and disintegrates. And so to answer Ann Kioya's question, this fourth scenario that she talks about is embedded within those three scenarios. We actually had 4, but one read very similar to others, and so we had to take it out for that reason. Now, when it comes to the issue that Nancy is raising about what are the headlines, in System ya Matapeli, we actually had, in the detailed version, the election was actually postponed. And in this case, COVID, because at the time we were doing the scenarios, COVID was at the peak. So people's sensories in that regard were quite high. The elections was actually postponed, and it was to give the merchant politicians the space to quickly reorganize themselves, especially when they started sensing that people were angry and they could vote otherwise. The other big headline was that big data or government data was being used to camouflage the real state of affairs, so that you create this narrative of efficiency and effectiveness. In the second scenario, the big headline there was Ber Biro Irwa, which means goodness is coming our way, or Fororine Wito type of thing. And that's why we are calling them actually in the scenarios, we've actually given presidential candidates names, but the reason why I omitted that now is because of the sensitivities of the elections, and you don't want to get caught up in that politics as well. So we discussed the issues rather than the names. And in the last scenario, it was really an issue of demagogues, and it really is about, everyone, survival for the fittest, and everyone for themselves.
Thank you. There are others who have joined us. June, good to see you. Jessica, as always, good to see you. Jessica raises an important question. That I think for me, I have been reflecting about as we have continued with this. Christian faith appears to be a key premise for the hustler narrative positioning, a leverage for its future entrenchment in society. What opportunities does it offer Christian constituency in search for an ethical leader, and potentially swaying of a larger youthful majority? So initially, initially, I would say, and I would actually like to hear. We have a few people from outside of Kenya. I know Dr. Gaze is joining us. It would be nice for you to make some comments to see whether there are any parallels, for example, with what you see in Ghana, for example, in terms of the election period. Do you see these sorts of things? And how does this translate for you? But for Jessica's question, initially the hustler narrative kind of co-opted the whole Christian thing in it, but it is interesting because in other ways we have seen the dynasty, or whatever we want to call it, or Azimio, now that it has a name, also find inroads, but using a different kind of perspective, and trying to co-opt religion into this, as always happens at this time. What would you say around Jessica's very important questions?
Unfortunately, in Kenya, we have a lot of contradictions, just like the way we saw the data on youth and the issue around corrupt leadership. One of the things people don't acknowledge is just because somebody says they are aligned to the church doesn't mean that they're the right leaders, or they are not corrupt, or they don't have, aligning. And the point to make here is that political, campaigns is about wooing, your the woman, so to speak, right? And you want to put your best foot forward. But we have other options, and if you look at the landscape right now, we have many other candidates who, for example, are not mainstream politicians, but probably would pass in terms of whether it's integrity, whether it's in fact more religious affiliation than even the two of them that are the so called front runners. But what is happening is that this, whether it's the religious leaders or Christians themselves, are not sitting down to critically question why is it that why are they not interrogating these narratives further, and in fact consolidating their vote to vote for those people who they can vouch for as not being corrupt and haven't been in mainstream politics and cannot be associated with any, for example, corruption that has been there. And so for me, the sad part about it is that and I'll reiterate a lot of the conversations I've had with political analysts, is that Kenyans seem to like dysfunction. They seem to like their rogue politicians. And now the media has also, because the politicians own the media, we are now, we are in a sense, I don't know whether it's coerced or, been made to believe that we only have two choices. And that's not the case. So now, because the calls are too close, somebody actually mentioned to me that, for example, if I voted for Kigame, it would be a vote against Raila. And so I must discard those that are not going to win by all means, so that I can, for example, try and get the one who is a better of the lesser evils. And the point, to reiterate what, PLO and his colleague said once on TV, is that we will be eaten. If the choices we have are the two, we will be eaten. The choice is whether we will be eaten either by the jackal or, by another being. But the point to make here is that we have choices, but we are not critically thinking about how do we save ourselves as Kenyans from what we have already seen as the options that will not work for us. So, I wanted to talk about a point that was mentioned by Okola about young people, and he said that if I heard him correctly, that the elite insecurity will be more than the voter fallout. But for me, the unfortunate, I don't think I agree with that sentiment, partly because unfortunately the elite need to safeguard what they have consolidated over time. Unfortunately, they then will get this, the voters or the ordinary people, the young people, to do the dirty work for them. Now, we are also underestimating how much, disadvantaged, of course, because of COVID and many other, things that are going on. We are underestimating how much the anger it has caused among young people. And so what we are saying is that I think we have the capacity to mobilize many more young people, especially because of the anger they feel at the disenfranchisement they have, to do more harm than there has been before. It's only that this time it's not as loud as it has been, and it's not as overt. But my worry is that it is quiet and it is simmering in different quarters in different ways, and we are not addressing it because we want to believe that we have a peaceful country. The other point I think that is unfortunate for me in Kenya is that when the violence is not close to us, we feel like Kenya is peaceful. And so, you know, whatever is happening in Kapedo and others, to us, Kenya is still peaceful as long as that is not coming to us. And that is a really unfortunate situation, you know, and my sense is that we need to be more vigilant. For us who can pray, we need to pray more, because I think people are much more disgruntled than they have been before, and we need to watch and just ask, how can we mobilize people? Not especially to address these issues, the structural issues that need to be addressed. And when we say that these things will be there past August, my worry is that because we like peace more than, you know, facing the hard truths and addressing the structural issues that must be addressed, we leave them until when we have a heightened national issue that gives us much more tension. Then that's when we start speaking about it. Right now there is drought, but because we have something to eat, we're not speaking about it as a national crisis as it should until it comes to our doorstep. And that's the tragedy with politics and public life in Kenya.
I would like Darius to respond to what you've to your, I don't know what to call it, an objection or a different perspective. But before he does that, I think we might need to come back to Jessica's question, because Jessica's question is, okay, so if Christian faith or Christians can be co-opted into Christian as a constituency in this, you know, race for votes and so on, what can be done or what should be done? I think as Christians we can pray, yeah, and I think there is an important part for that to happen. But I think there's also a question that is very critical that must be asked: what else can be done by those who are in positions of authority, that for those who listen, because there is a constituency that does listen to what the church says. So I think I'm going to park that there, but I think I would want Darius to respond to your comment briefly, but I also wanted to respond to Josh Kikuvi's very interesting perspective, because he says, I think social media has become its own sector. It is an institution with its own rules of the game and gatekeepers. And so there's a whole thing going on over there. We can talk about youth and social media, but the social media world itself does not operate like, it operates different than the real world, and you know, is a center of opinion shaping by itself. I would want Darius to comment on those two really quickly, and then we can address one or two others. Yeah, before we come to a close, I'd also like Reverend Odera to make some comments as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kiama. Thank you, Dr. Stevie, on that. I would actually agree. I think I didn't go far enough in terms of trying to place or situate this new growing sort of socioeconomic subculture, which also has its own political dimension, which is the fact that for the longest time, or at least within the nuance of how we've shaped class conversations in this country, you've always had so let's look, for example, at 2002 or 2007, where it was very clear in terms of quite fairly clear in terms of gang culture in the country. I mean, you had and some of these names in terms of our gang cultures were clear. You know, Jeshi la Mzee, Jeshi la Embakasi, you know, Sungu Sungu, Amachuma, you know, all these gang culture that we know. But what is interestingly is we accidentally created a different kind of a subculture, which is almost like an upgrade from the old subculture of the usual vigilante,
to a vigilante that is more attuned to online articulation in terms of its visual. So it has enough nuance in terms of the, the academic and the education and the exposure to, sort of have a certain level of dissuasion from literally going to the streets to fight some of these battles. The cluster that will go to the street is still there. It's still a growing cluster relative to the population, segment. But also there's this new cluster that comes in, which almost creates some sort of a mini buffer between how we've always known. You have your political class with their resources, and then you have your gangs and vigilantes. But then now you have this new sort of underclass that is well-educated, articulate, equally frustrated as fairly uneducated bodies within the informal settlements. But they are far less dissuaded, at least by my last sort of conversation and foray into that space, to go to the streets. But they're equally vitriol in terms of, and that's why I say that they offer a different kind of violence. They don't offer no violence. They offer a different kind of violence in terms of, you'll see them in the social media streets and how vitriol it can get in these streets and how, vulnerable they are to, being had as a political, essentially a political tool for shaping narratives online and fighting some of these online battles on, for most of the political cluster. So it isn't essentially an end to what we know as operational street violence. It's just that you've created a new cluster that offers its own type of violence as, an asset to politicians. But also we know how class structures work in this country in such that one, either professional or social class offers a buffer to the next or to the next one as you go up, in terms of the police as a cluster offer a buffer to a certain cluster above them from those below them. But then you have this new interesting sort of socioeconomic subculture developing in that space. And so that is how I looked at, they offer a different kind of violence. One, they serve two utility values. They offer a different kind of violence, but also given how social class and violence, sort of coalesce, they offer a sort of a buffer. It's accidental, but it's there, sort of, armed to how politicians basically operate. And essentially, I think, as you mentioned, Dr. Kiama, the dynamic, especially on youth as a sector and especially youths online as a sector, that will be a big conversation. We have to remember that in 2007, we had Cambridge Analytica, or the BCL, the initial organizations, and there are many other organizations in that space. And from 2013, our understanding of the online capacity to shape narratives has been very significant in how we do our political conversations. And I don't think that's going to end now. It's going to be still there. Tentative conversations with some of the key players in that space will already tell you, some of them already have their machineries at work. Mozilla literally has had almost 6-7 exposés in basically the last, almost once a month, detailing how different facets of the online dimension of the political war in this country has been going on. I know they have a few more going, coming up in the coming months. So that tells you not only are the youths, and especially the youths online, a critical segment of our political conversation and the logistics and the infrastructure of it, but also the fact that that also means a significant portion of our political perceptions and our political narratives have been moved online, and to a significant degree also weaponized. And so, yeah, it is supposed to be considered at that level of nuance. And, I think the upside of it is that there are people who've been in that space, people who've been examining the evolution of not just the youth, but essentially the online community or Kenyans who are online, and how the narrative conversations there distill into the everyday political conversations on the ground, in the cafes, at home. So yeah, definitely it's worth considering as its own sort of subculture, as a niche. But also the beauty of it is there are people who are already tracking it and have been in that space examining it. And a lot of what they produce already about that is online. So yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Good to see you, Moses, Patricia. I saw another name there. Thank you for those who have joined us. Really appreciate it. I want to bring in Gowi because there's a good question asked by Abel Simiu, which, if I were to summarize it, I would put it this and we talked about it a little earlier, if the church is viewed as a constituency to be co-opted into the whole, election thing, and one faction, the hustlers, will find a one overt way of engaging those, and the other side will also find another way of drawing people in. Abel raises the question, that's an important question. The role of the worship center, the role of the pastor, the minister, in shaping morality of aspiring leaders, through the engagement in that space. But I might even ask here, shaping the morality of or the moral compass or ethical compass. Reverend Dera, what do you see there?
I think and thank you for allowing me to be on this platform, Dr. Kiama. And thank you, Katindi, for your expose. It's good to see you after a while. I hazard a guess here, but I'm not sure the average minister of the gospel in Kenya understands the power of the pulpit and the power to shape thinking, shape lives, but also there's a place of speaking truth, and truth is the truth of the gospel itself. And so to give a very, I'm not sure, maybe we can ask a follow-up question on this, but I'm not sure that the message of transformation on our engagement really resonates from a place that the pastor or the clergy understands the power of the pulpit to literally shape minds. By allowing a politician to take that position, you abdicate a responsibility. A politician will not give you their position to make a statement. A politician will hog every opportunity to push their particular agenda. But I'm not sure that the average preacher understands the power and the place of the pulpit to transform and shape the lives of people. But I'm going to ask you, Dr. Kiama, can you ask a follow-up question on this, or maybe ask me that question differently? I don't know if I've really understood it.
Let me say, okay, so we've looked at the scenarios, and the scenarios, to put it this way, as a Christian, as a preacher, let's go back to the pulpit. The scenarios are basically the book of Amos. This is what this is Amos saying, look, we are all doomed unless something happens. Yes. This is Habakkuk saying, look, the fig tree is not going to, and so I think the minor prophets especially were very good at painting scenarios of what it looks like when a people have abdicated their responsibility for moral governance in society. And so the question that we want to ask is, so how, what is the role of the church as a space? I think that is what Abel was saying. The church as a space, and the leader in steering this, because in one instance we can look at the scenarios and try to prepare ourselves for the eventuality. But then we can also look at the scenarios and say, what is it that people can do preemptively from a religious space point of view, either as a leader or as a church?
Okay.
I don't know if that helps.
It does help. I've had this conversation severally in just the past 1 month. So it's interesting you've asked that question. I've asked, how is it that currently, as we're speaking, the public space is being dominated by three players? The public space is being dominated by the politician who wants the vote, by business interests who are financing these politicians, and lastly by the media. Yet there's a particular player who has the opportunity of engaging in what I call I won't say an unbiased, but a critical voice in asking and interrogating the platforms, the basis, the foundations of what these other people do. The politician's interest is re-election. That's the interest. The business interest is for profit and looking for increasing their profits or a stable environment to make their profits. The media is optics. Whereas for the church, it's the heart. It's what transforms people in itself. And I think the role the church needs to recognize is that's what you need to be able to do. It's not necessarily just to speak truth to power, but to speak truth to the heart of each individual, to be able to mirror the truth of the word of God, because that's what God's word does. It mirrors who we really are. And I think that is what the church's role is to do, show you who you really are. And I'm not sure Kenyans understand, or the voter understands, that the heart is desperately wicked. We are we want our interests, and our interests are actually self-seeking and self-serving. And left to our own devices, we would self-destruct. And so I think that the constituency or the church in itself, that is the role. The role is to show the voter who they really are and call them to a place of reformation of the heart, the goodness of God that can be seen in all of us, that expression. Now, the role of the leader within the church is to be a shepherd, to shepherd conversations, to shepherd thinking, to shepherd the church and greater constituency through these particular issues. Let me give you an example. I asked some of the bishops and leaders who have been talking to in the past 1 month why there seems to be a silence, and this is my conclusion. Why you don't hear the church or the voice of Christians resonating in this public space is, one, those who have attempted have got their fingers burnt before, and so they don't want to go this again. There's another group of people who are indifferent about it. There's another group who are saved and going to heaven, but useless on earth, so to speak. So
there's a comment over here that actually said that, yeah.
So they are so averse of what's going on, okay? Then there is another group of people who have got their hand in the proverbial cookie jar and have all the sugar and crumbs on their mouth, okay? I've lost the moral authority to speak prophetically into the situation. But there's a minor group of people who are still trying to do something. But like our good friend John the Baptist, they're a lone voice in the wilderness. And I think we need to be able to hear those voices. They are there. And the interesting thing is that there's so much noise that's happening. Kiama, there's so much noise happening that you can't hear them, but they are speaking. They are talking about these particular things. They might not have the noise and the place of the blogosphere, as the previous contributor talked about, you know, how there are those who have leveraged on social media platforms that are so loud. But they are there. And I think there's a place that we need to engage them and amplify their voices so that they can be heard. But they're not going to come and operate on the spaces that we are in. But those voices are there. So they need to be shepherded, and the audience needs to look away. It's not necessarily just talk to the leaders, because I think the assumption, Kiama, is that we think the leaders are the problem, and it's not. It's actually us who are the problem, and to move from there. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We actually, believe it or not, we've run out of time. I do want to give our lead panelist the last word. I know your hand has been up for a while, but as it gets hotter, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to just say what's really burning on your heart, and then for the rest of us to say thank you so much for joining us. I want to make a comment right at the end, because we're going to need to send you a link to the book that we talked about. I looked at some of that material, and it addresses some of these questions that are over here because it's a little bit more elaborate. But yeah, Katindi, last one.
I was going to comment on just the question that Pastor Goy was commenting on. And I think for me, what is problematic about how the Christians, or whether it's the church, engages with politics is that we're very eventful. And yet these issues are ongoing from day to day. So that, for example, right now there's hyperactivity for, the church to host politicians. But how come we never call politicians to give a social account of how they are managing resources, or how they are governing, or how they are making decisions? And so we make it eventful and not a culture of good governance, and no wonder we are not getting results. And so that's my first response. I think the second one is that what we don't understand is that we are feeding political interests at this point, right? Like Pastor Goy rightly says, the politician just wants to be elected, and they will go to whoever cares to listen. And in fact, actually, I was in NCCK conference. I was a speaker there for the annual, meeting. And I said to them, this is the point in time when the, politicians are going to come. And the guest of honor said, actually, the reason why we love the church is because we have crowds we don't have to pay for. And so if the church understands that we are just being used, then I hope they will get their act together in that regard. Then the issue about the church, of course, the church speaks to the heart, yes, but I think sometimes we have assumptions about whether all of us are in it for transformation. And I really like the categorization that he has given, because right now, if you think about all of us who call ourselves Christians, right now the Christian garment has been dropped down, and we have the ethnic garment for us to be able to elect the political leader that speaks to us. And so this Christian faction is sort of like a second tier of importance at this point of hyper-political activity. And I think we should come alive to that as a reality, and we stop kidding ourselves that we can consolidate the Christian vote at this point in time. For me, the Christian vote can be consolidated if we make it a culture of good governance, to call leaders to account over time, and so that we can demonstrate that we are interested in the culture of good governance and not events. The last thing I wanted to say is that politics is much more complex than we think. So when one leader says, I'm a Christian, does that mean they are Christians? And the point here to make is that, unfortunately, the body of Christ, in my view, has not cared enough, at least not the majority of us, to understand the complexities of politics. We don't have that political education to understand these things. So we make commentaries, and we are not interested in systems change and systems thinking. And so for me, I think we need to understand the complexity of politics. We need to be consistent, and we need to have a critical mass of people. We need to build a critical mass of these people who are interested in good governance that Pastor Goy is talking about, so that we can make change. And lastly, we need to stop engaging in the spheres where everybody else is making noise. If we are a critical mass, why don't we create our own system that begins to talk about that issue where that other noise is not there, so that we can be distinct, and so that we can then begin to consistently make a difference. For me, the problem is we are going to the social media where everyone is. Our own spaces, we are giving it out to other people to come and pollute that space. We are not different, and our voice is not loud enough. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and maybe the John the Baptist idea is actually a pretty good one. Why don't we go out in the wilderness? Literally, I mean, and where what are they called? Camel skin and eat wild locusts. There's something about having a different story that is a draw or a different perspective. And I think we listen to that about John the Baptist and actually forget that there's something that he was trying to do. He was coming out from where all the other, there were many prophets at the time of John the Baptist. The Bible even says that there were other people who are, other voices that were speaking at the time. But John the Baptist was distinct in terms of his message and also his demeanor and the optics around it and the different things. So much so that his messages in the wilderness affected the elite, the ruling elite, to the point of where he lost his life. So thank you so much, June, for the comment about patriotism. I think that factors very much into what Reverend Odera and Dr. Katindi are saying. Josh, yeah, I think good comments about transformation and intergenerational perspective, transformation and generations. That's something we haven't talked a lot about, but again, it's an important part of this conversation. That's Reverend Odera talked about in terms of the history keeping, which is something that really we need to do a better job of. We've come to the end. We are a few minutes beyond what was our usual time. I'd like to give a final word for our hosts from the Project on Religious Freedom and Society in Africa, Dr. Mike Glerup. Thank you so much for having us. Nora Langat, who's from here but working out of New Haven for a short while longer. Mike, over to you.
No, thank you, Katinde and all the other panelists. It was a very insightful discussion into what's going on in Kenya, and we're glad that we could be able to participate in it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Our host behind the scenes, now we can get to see her, Nora Langat. Thank you so much for what you're doing. It would be good to hear your voice one more time.
Absolutely. I joined Michael Glerup in echoing the thanks of the Council on African Studies for this generative conversation. I mean, so many gems. I think I'm still thinking of what Dr. Sibi has said over again about the need for not eventful reaction, but creating more of a systematic response to events that are happening in our political atmosphere. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Keep your ear to the ground. With the emails that you've given us, with your permission, we want to send you a link for some of the material that Dr. Katindi has been working with, so that you can read it for yourself and use it to generate conversations. Some of you are leaders over here. Go and generate conversations in your own spheres as well. And watch out for another major event. We have generally have two events in a year. Listen out for our next major event, which we're going to be having another speaker, and we'll let you know as time goes by. So thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.